Good morning, ladies. Welcome to our first in-person conference in way too long. Yeah, no kidding. So glad to see everybody here. Glad that you guys were able to travel and get here and be with us in person. For those of you who are with us on Zoom, we sure appreciate that you're with us as well. Hopefully you'll get to join us in person in the spring when we're in DC. But for those in the room, it's lovely to see all the faces in person this morning, not to knock the Zoom or anything, but it's just a little different seeing a smile in person. This is our first in-person conference for a while. Hopefully everybody's been enjoying it so far. We had our dinner last night and our reception. I hear good feedback from everybody about that. If you have any comments, please.
Please reach out to myself or Rebecca Kumar, or if you see Brandy or Sherry.
There you go.
Comments. We'd love to hear them so we can use them in future planning. And yes,
This morning with a panel that is probably one of the most timely that we have done in a long time. I don't know if you noticed the news when you woke up this morning and saw the backup of ships in the LA harbor. But all of that is part and parcel of what we're going to be talking about this morning, going over supply chain, how it works in the US, how it works over in Asia, the legal issues that pop up when those two intersect, and kind of talking through the current issues, how COVID has affected things, and what we should expect going forward. We've put together an amazing panel of fantastic ladies who do this on a day-to-day basis. I personally don't have any experience in this field, so I was very interested to hear what they had to say, and I think you're going to be interested as well. I'm going to start by introducing the two ladies that we have here in the room with us today. Patricia Burgess is from Nashville, Tennessee, and she chairs Frost Brown Todd's automotive industry team and leads their representation relating to troubled automotive suppliers, including large supplier and automotive bankruptcies and supply chain risk management matters. Sheryl Toby is with Dykema Gossett PLLC in Detroit, Michigan. She regularly advises manufacturing entities in a wide variety of day-to-day supply chain matters. She also works closely with purchasing groups, in-house legal counsel, finance, and other business teams in developing strategies for addressing business challenges that intersect operational and legal issues. On the Zoom, there you are, ladies. We have Judy Baranowski. She's with AlixPartners in Southfield, Michigan. She's a seasoned advisor to senior executives and board members, specializing in leading enterprise-wide transformations while working hands-on with teams to move with speed from strategy to implementation and results. Her experience spans operations, supply chain, procurement, quality, customer service, sales and operations planning, top-line growth, new product development, strategy, acquisitions, divestitures, working capital management, financial analysis, and leveraging data. She's a busy lady. And then finally, but certainly not least, we have Wen Lie joining us all the way from Singapore. Wen is an M&A partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers. She's a seasoned advisor to senior executives, shareholders, and board members, specializing in managing large-scale integrations, carve-outs, divestments, and restructuring transformations. This is a powerhouse team of very impressive ladies who are right in the thick of the supply chain issues going on around the world right now, and I am looking forward to hear what they have to say. And I'm going to run the PowerPoint from here, but I'm going to hand it off to you ladies to get started.
We'll lay a foundation, but then feel free to ask questions if, as we go. We'd like to answer what you want to know.
Thank you, Sheryl. I neglected to say that. If anybody in the room has a question at any point during the presentation, if you'll just raise your hand so that you can get my attention, we'll make sure that we lob it up to these ladies to help us with. Okay, Judy, are you going to get us kicked off?
Yeah, I'll absolutely get you kicked off. Are you showing the presentation on Zoom as well?
We are. I don't know if you can see. Well, there we go. Now we are. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, terrific. So we're going to start off with the first slide, which is a year like no other. Would it be possible to go to that one?
Oh, yes, I certainly can. Hang on, let me go back.
Perfect. So Very good to be with all of you this morning, even though it is remote. Can't wait to be in the same room with you soon. So the next slide, what we're going to do here is we're going to quickly walk through just a characterization of what's going on in the world and how it's impacting companies and consumers. And then we'll talk in the panel discussion about how that relates to each of us directly. So this picture here is a semiconductor chip shortage. You're looking at trucks that are at the Louisville Speedway that are awaiting semiconductor chips. The automotive industry just for last year, or excuse me, this coming year is expected to lose hundreds of billions of dollars due to this. Lumber, the lumber industry is also impacted by the supply chain shortages due to the pandemic. Housing prices are up over 36% in the last 18 months, and home improvement is also driving up shortages. The steel situation, steel is also impacted. Prices are significantly higher than they were just 18 months ago. The stocks of those companies are going up, but the pressure for supply is there. Shelves are empty. This is a beer and wine shelf. And the reason is some of the componentry in terms of literally glue for labels and the caps and seals are in short supply. This is what we were just talking about a second ago. This is actually a picture a couple weeks ago of 54 ships off of the coast. It's up to over 90 now. And the turnaround time in terms of getting the containers on shore and into the supply chain is significant. And there's a truck shortage as well once they get on shore. Not only is the supply chain extended, but the costs are going up. It costs multiple times higher, both to the US and to Europe, for containers to be shipped. And the situation continues. This is just a couple of weeks ago in London for fuel shortages. There's fuel lines at the gas pumps, and there's also empty shelves because of panic buying due to perceived and real shortages. So despite all this, if you look at the credit ratings, the credit rating upgrades are actually outpacing the downgrades. And then the implication to companies is it's a long list. It impacts everything from their operating profit to cash, both ways, up and down, as well as their credit ratings. And the headlines from the Times, from the papers are, shortages are here to stay, get used to it. I went for the look on Asia.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks, ladies.
Wen, let me stop you for just a minute. Can you ladies hear them well? Okay, just wanted to make sure the volume is good. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Very warm welcome. And I'm really sorry I can't be there. And the reason I can't be in the US at the moment is that actually the restrictions in Singapore are quite tight. And if I would go and leave the country, I may not be able to return. So that's the direct impact on me. But let me just give you a short view of what's actually happened in Asia. Maybe we go to the next slide. Because one of the reasons why we wanted to show the impact on Asia. Oh, do we have that slide?
Let's see.
All right. Well, if we don't have it, it's fine. I had actually sent the slide across to show what is actually the output of China, because everybody knows that China is the world's manufacturing superpower, but how big is it really? And it's actually around 30% of the global manufacturing output comes from China. And as a comparison, the second closest is the US, and that stands about 17%. So it's just to imagine the scale and enormity of what's actually being produced in China and why it's so important to have that understanding of the impact of the supply chain. I think before COVID happened, there was already a lot of discussions on the US and China trade war, the tensions, and that was exactly because of this issue, right? Because US doesn't want to be that dependent on China. So I think before COVID happened, you could already see that shift of can we diversify, how can we de-risk our supply chains? And COVID has accelerated that. So organizations were starting to de-risk. They have started to move operations to Vietnam, to Malaysia, to Southeast Asia. even to Mexico, moving some plants back to the US. But COVID has accelerated that. In addition, with the COVID situation, companies have been trying to de-risk their operations, managing stocks differently, focusing on digital supply chain. All the items that were highlighted by Judy, companies are thinking, okay, as long as I try to really understand, if I know where my goods are, then I can manage it. That was the initial wave of the supply chain. Let's say the supply chain impact on operations, where people really tried to get a grip on their supply chain because frankly, they didn't know where all their stuff was. So that was one of the first things they tried to do. And then after that, there was the view like, okay, actually, even if we know where things are, it still doesn't resolve it. So we're in a situation where a lot is happening. But maybe I take a step back and just take you through what actually happened in Asia when COVID happened. We actually saw a strong focus on the food supply chain. So governments were less focused on the supply chain for manufacturing outputs outside of the country, but they were very internally focused, and the main focus was around food. So travel restrictions impacting movements for foreign workers that were needed to harvest crops. That was a huge issue because we have enormous amounts of people traveling across to try and go to Indonesia and help harvest, or go to Malaysia and harvest. Traders couldn't go out into the fields to actually buy the crops. And then we're not even talking about the production, the output of the manufacturers who actually need to produce and work through all the food company, the food processing companies. So that was the main priority of different governments. But obviously productivity had dropped significantly. The shutdown in ports was a major issue. Train depots, factories, everything was just shut down. But overall, I think we had less impact in Asia on the supply chain because our supply chains are just a bit shorter. I think also not as sophisticated. So in general, we didn't see shortages in the supermarkets like Judy just shared. And it was very interesting that the supply chain between retail and wholesale was completely separate. And we actually didn't know that. And COVID made that very, very, very visible. So now companies need to try and find how can they actually bridge that to be more resilient? Should they change their SKUs so you can swap quickly, because they do understand that this pandemic is gonna stay for a while and disruption is gonna stay. So what do we see now? Actually, China is up in productivity. We're almost at pre-COVID levels and even higher. But the lack of shipping capacity, that remains a concern out of China. There's still the lack of containers. They're used as storage or in the wrong places. The trucking equipment is a major issue. Actually, COVID made the underinvestment in the supply chain infrastructures in countries very, very visible. So for instance, in countries like Vietnam, they're struggling to cope with relocation of factories that already started pre-COVID, and they're now dealing with huge volumes that they can't handle. So roads are insufficient, the ports are insufficient, and on top of that, you have COVID. Right? So it's all on top of. The electronic part shortages are still an issue. People are always pointing to China, but actually the chips are quite difficult. There's a lot of assembly and sub-components going on in Southeast Asia, so it goes through China, or it comes from China, goes into Southeast Asia, gets assembled, goes to Vietnam, then goes through the free trade area through to the US. So it's quite a complex supply chain, and it's under a lot of stress. More recent developments, I don't know if it's an issue in the US, but here is actually quite often in the news, the China power outages that are that we see. The growth in maybe I just changed that a little bit. The power outages that were already there are now enlarged because the Chinese government is putting so much pressure on the local provinces to go to clean and renewable energies, and the governments in the provinces actually have very limited tools. So they need to resort to very crude measures like closing down a coal power plant, and there's already a shortage in coal. So you can see that all of that drives up the pressure on electricity. And actually, if the price of producing electricity is higher than the government capped prices, then also some of the companies are just shutting down and saying, you know what, we're under maintenance and we can't produce. And this all has a knock-on effect on the productivity of China. And this morning it was even in the news that the expectations are that this will impact productivity for Christmas. So that may be another shortage that we will have to face. So what do we expect going forward? That lines are drawn, between US and China. That the trade war remains an issue. Tariffs are adversely affecting cost. Globalization, as they call it, for moving local and global supply chains and kind of merging them. That will take time. Southeast Asia takes time to develop from an infrastructure perspective. It's really not ready to take on China. Moving production to the US or Mexico will also take time. The question is whether the US will be able to deliver against the same cost. One of the examples is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. They've been put under a lot of pressure to move productivity to the US, and they've said, we will do it, it's fine. But actually, we want to give you a warning that cost will rise if we do that. And then who will pick up the bill? So those extra costs, the continued freight rates and the congestion on the China-US trans-Pacific shipping lines, all will add to the cost. The different strategies that companies take to manage buffer stocks, to de-risk, and I'm sure the ladies will come up with a lot of examples of how companies are trying to secure their supply chain. But all these things actually add a lot of cost. And how that will be impacting the economy is something that we will have to wait and see. But I think we're all quite worried about it. Maybe I'll give it back to the panel in the room.
Thank you. So good morning. I'd say most of you have experienced the disruption in the supply chain, whether it's what you see on your grocery stores or dealing with it in your clients. So we're going to talk about a few of the high-level legal issues. And if there are experiences or questions that you have, we don't want to sit here and speak at you. Please feel free to interact with us. So one of the things that you have probably seen a lot of or have been looking a lot at are the force majeure provisions that are in the contracts. The first question you ask, I've run up against this issue, I cannot get product, or the government has shut me down. Who's responsible? Am I on the hook? Am I not on the hook? And so looking at your force majeure, the first place you need to look obviously is at your contract, because the contract is going to govern, and they can range across all variations as to what your contract may say. What is typically included in a force majeure are the things that you would think of: natural disasters, the tsunami that hit Japan that had a major disruption in the automotive supply chain a number of years ago, war, or some governmental mandates. What you haven't typically seen before now is a pandemic or an epidemic. And I think we're going to start seeing more and more companies evaluate whether those should be included in your force majeure provisions. Something else that is typically not included in a force majeure that we are seeing a lot of today are the labor shortages, strikes, and the inability to perform if there is a price or cost increase. What is happening with the supply chain disruption is driving the prices up. You can't get product. It's your typical supply and demand situation. And so a lot of the distress that we are seeing, me particularly in the automotive industry, raw material prices have gone up and labor prices have gone up, which how do you pass that along to your customer unless you have some ability in your contract? And we'll talk a little bit about the pricing issues. What do these provisions typically do? They give the parties an opportunity to pause performance during the force majeure event. So it's very important to understand if you have those rights. If you are somebody that needs the supply, pausing performance is not an option, particularly if you're dealing in a just-in-time inventory situation like in the automotive industry. So there are typically ways that the customers will work with their suppliers. I think we were all anticipating a lot more distress in the automotive space given the pandemic. And I think Sheryl and I both have used the analogy. It's somewhat like the house of cards. If any one card falls, the entire house will fall. So we have actually seen a tremendous amount of cooperation throughout the entire supply chain to make sure that we're keeping parts running, whether it's the chip shortage that has caused a slowdown across the production lines. That has actually given a little bit of relief to some of the other suppliers that might be supplying into a particular OEM. And so you look at those provisions. If you don't have a provision in your contract, then there are some common law ways to evaluate whether it's frustration of purpose, impossibility of performance, or if it's a sale of goods under Article 2, you've got UCC 615, which has been codified in most states in some form. And in the materials that we provided, there are some summaries of cases on all of those concepts, at least in the footprint in which my firm operates. One of the key things to think about, though, in those provisions, it all comes down to foreseeability. If you could anticipate there was going to be an event, it's going to be very difficult for you to prove to a court or the other party that you should be excused from your performance. Again, the things that are typically foreseeable are economic circumstances. Just because it costs more to do something doesn't give you an excuse not to perform. The question really becomes, though, for the supplier, at what point are you selling a product at a negative margin to where you simply can't survive if the customer doesn't give you some relief? So I'm not going to go through the details of impossibility of performance or frustration of purpose, but the things I want you to think about as you're looking at those provisions really are, is the act or the event foreseeable? And if it was foreseeable, you're likely not going to get relief. The other thing to think through on those concepts is it has to be something that is so extreme that it really is impossible or so impractical to perform that you get excused. Courts construe those provisions very narrowly. So as you're counseling with clients, if they do not have force majeure provisions in their contracts, I strongly encourage you to put those in so you can at least dictate what will or will not excuse performance, whether you are the shipper or the receiver on any given product. Another area that we really are seeing in the supply chain, as I indicated, was price. As products continue, raw materials continue to increase, the product itself can't be sold for the same profit margin. If you don't have a mechanism in your contract to be able to adjust price, then there is going to become a tipping point where you're not going to be able to continue to survive as a viable entity and still make that product. Some of the issues that I have found interesting lately is if you don't have a contract, do you maybe have one and not realize it? Many suppliers that I have experienced lately are shipping goods, and when things go well, there's never an issue. It's when things start going in the wrong direction that they go, well, wait a minute, you're shipping under my terms. And the seller says, no, I'm shipping under my terms. And you get into a battle of the forms. And many times, if you look at the terms and conditions as drafted, acceptance by performance is a very enforceable provision. So you get a purchase order to deliver a product. I ship you the product. I think my terms and conditions on the back of my purchase orders govern. The buyer says, no, 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 no. My terms and conditions are on our website. And when I issued the purchase order to you, those are what govern. And simply by you shipping the product, you've accepted my terms by performance. And then you get into a situation where whose contract governs. So if there's an issue there, make sure you're counseling your clients on rejection of terms and or negotiating specific contracts. Does your contract have a price adjustment? Again, some will have raw material adjusters in them that will be based on federal or national indexes. Well, we saw this issue with the steel and the aluminum when we had the tariffs go into effect. If there's not a mechanism to allow for that to be passed through to your ultimate customer, you may be, as the supplier, absorbing that cost. And then again, at what point does that become unworkable and you can't continue to supply? If you are in a situation where you have to continue to perform, and when you're dealing with situations like Sheryl and I deal with in the automotive space, and it's a just-in-time situation, you cannot stop your production, or you could potentially cause massive damages to your ultimate customer if you shut down a line or interrupt production. how long are you required to sell at that price? Is the purchase order for a limited period of time? Is it for a long period of time? Many of our salesmen or our buyers, they're interested in getting the product out there. They don't focus on what the terms of sale are, again, until they run into situations like this. What are the termination provisions? Make sure you understand and they understand how and when they can terminate. And if they need to use that mechanism, how long can they absorb the price increases or the cost before they are in a position to where they can terminate? But again, as we're looking at the situation now from a very practical perspective, even if the contracts don't allow adjustments or termination provisions, many of the customers will recognize if they need the product, they're going to do some form of accommodation to assist the supplier in getting the product to them, either through a price increase for a temporary period of time or some forgiveness on amount of product that's being shipped if it's not particularly needed in their supply. Labor shortages and increased cost, again, are rarely force majeure events. So those are things that we're really starting to see some impact. We're talking about the cargo, and the logistics is not necessarily my area of expertise, but I did find the cargo to be a very interesting topic. And I have a few in my office, so I was able to get some interesting examples from them. Again, many parties are shipping product by air, land, and sea. And when things were running without any hiccups, you would order, ship your goods, pay what you owed, and things moved without any concern. As we're starting to see the shortages, the worldwide container shortages, we came to realize even very large clients did not have negotiated contracts with their carriers. And so you were left at the will of their bills of lading or the Carriage of Goods by Sea Act. And there are some crazy things in that act when you look at the provisions. And some examples, we had a particular case where if there's an emergency, the carrier can drop your goods at any port. You pay for the storage while they're at that port, and then you've got to figure out a way to get another shipper to get them from the port to your final destination and still pay the first carrier, even though they didn't get them where they belonged. And what is defined as an emergency is a very broad and vague defined concept. As you would imagine, the terms are very favorable to the carrier. Another situation, product comes into the port and it sits there because there aren't trucks able to carry the product, or the rail systems are being overloaded. And you, as the shipper, are responsible for the storage costs while they sit at that port for that period of time. Another interesting example that we dealt with, the goods were shipped and there were minimums as to what we had to provide through this carrier. Well, there's a container shortage. If the carrier cannot provide enough containers for us to ship the goods that we have for that minimum, is that a force majeure event? Does that give us any relief? And then then we had both. That turned out to ultimately be our maximum as well as our minimum. So we needed to continue to ship product beyond that. And because they were short on containers, they said, no, that's all we're going to do. And we had no other resource lined up. So they really have us in a tight position because of the limited ability for them to ship. And if you haven't negotiated contracts, you very much are at their whim. So just something to be thinking about as this is starting to go through the system. We're starting to see a lot of the bigger corporations that do a lot of rail and ocean carrier shipping now negotiating for specific tariffs and terms to know that we have the transportation that we need to make sure we get the product, either whether we're shipping it to our ultimate customers or receiving the product from our suppliers. So as you're looking at this, of course, we're all going to expect that there is a ripple. There's going to be financial distress in our suppliers and potentially into the customers if they're not able to get the product that they need. So just talking a little bit about some things to be thinking through if you're dealing with a financially troubled supplier. Monitoring, early protection, early detection is the best protection. So what sort of monitoring systems do you have in place? Think about the triggering events that could drive financial distress in a particular supplier. Have you seen a natural disaster, a tsunami, a pandemic that could ripple? Have there been product recalls, data breaches? We're seeing a lot of cyber attack and ransomware issues. Have there been certain government regulations like the increased tariffs that could impact? And then just the general supply chain distress, whether it's at the tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 level, those will eventually ripple themselves up. If you don't already require regular financial reporting from your suppliers, and monitor those that might be on a watch list. Many of the financial troubles trigger from operational troubles outside of a supply chain hiccup. And the things that you can look for, are you seeing a spike in non-conforming goods that are being delivered? Are they missing shipments? Are there other quality issues with the shipments that you're receiving? Are you having to pay for premium freight because they're not able to get the product to you timely, so they have to expedite getting it to you? Are there plants closing? Are there management changes? Are there employees turning over? If you keep a close watch on the suppliers, then that helps you to manage whether or not you're going to see a potential hiccup in the supply chain coming of your goods. As you're looking at this, make sure you understand your rights and remedies under your contracts. Figure out which one applies first, but then look at those termination provisions and notice triggers if you need to have a quick exit. Then the other thing that we have to consider is, if you start to see some distress in a particular supplier, evaluate what your alternatives are. Can you get goods from another supplier? Are you single sourced? Are you dual sourced? If you're single sourced, is there other capacity in the market that you could move? What I'm seeing in a lot of situations is we're starting to see some contraction of the suppliers, and there are only so many out there that do this particular product or provide this particular service. And rather than continue to see them close, then it becomes a situation where the customers may need to provide either operational and or financial support to keep these companies alive, so that there's some competition and there's enough capacity in the market for the goods to continue to be supplied. What do you do if your supplier files bankruptcy? Just a few issues. Many of you are very, very versed in bankruptcies, but some things I want you to think about, particularly at the supply level. In the automotive industry, which is where I primarily work, but not exclusively, the primary goal is you have to keep supply coming. If you have any interruption in supply, it could have a horrible ripple effect all the way up to shutting down production. So the first thing is, will the debtor continue to perform? And many of the supplier cases, they will immediately go into court with their first days and file motions to continue to perform under their supply agreements. And those would include the ability to do ordinary course set-offs, warranty issues, and things of that nature. Will they move to compel assumption? If you're not seeing that, many times we know how difficult that is to compel early assumption of a contract. They're going to want to wait to see ultimately where the case is going to go, and whether a buyer or a reorganized debtor is going to want to continue to do business, whether your parts are profitable for the company or not. But one area that I seem to see a lot of where we want to make sure we're protecting ourselves and our suppliers, if you are operating under a long-term supply contract, 9 times out of 10, things are humming along just fine. They're shipping your parts, you're paying for them. There aren't going to be any outstanding cure amounts. But what about the contingent and unliquidated warranty claims that could exist? Many times you're not going to see those until months or maybe even years after the parts have been supplied. If you allow your contract to go through bankruptcy and either be assumed by the reorganized debtor or assumed and assigned to a buyer, and you have not made clear that they are assuming warranty and other liability obligations or responsibilities with respect to the parts that were shipped prior to the assumption, and you allowed it to go through with a zero cure, you very well just lost the ability to pursue any of those claims against the reorganized debtor or the buyer. And so in the materials, we've attached some samples of provisions that we typically negotiate either into the sale order or confirmation order to make clear that the reorganized debtor or the buyer will remain responsible for all ongoing liabilities, regardless of whether they arose before or after the assumption, so that you can make sure you're picking up that contingent liability on those parts. A few other things just to consider. Many of the customers will have tooling at a particular supplier that is owned by the customer. So you want to make sure that you don't have a lender who doesn't understand how the industry works and they try to take a priming lien on something that the debtor doesn't own. If you're representing lenders, make sure that they understand what their collateral package is at a particular supplier. Because I've had situations where pretty much everything on the plant floor at a particular supplier is not owned by the supplier. It is customer owned tooling, and then the ability to remove that tooling. Intellectual property is another very hot topic when you're dealing with a customer and supply relationship. Who designed the part? Who designed the tool? Who has the rights to that? If it's a supplier design tool and you need to move your production somewhere else, make sure you have rights either in your general terms and conditions or as part of your exit to make sure that that intellectual property can also be moved to an alternate supplier to keep your product continuing to flow. So I think those are some of the general topics. Cheryl's going to talk a little bit through the practical aspects of how we deal with these distress situations. And then if there are any questions or, war stories, we'd love to be able to share those and raise any issues that are of particular interest that you have.
So we do want to make this interactive, and these ladies are so knowledgeable, and we had a lot of interactive before. I did a lot of interviewing on some of the top companies in different areas before this discussion, literally up until late last night. And what we're facing now is nothing like any of us have ever faced before. And if you don't think this is going to impact you either in your daily lives or in your work situation, you're going to be surprised. And I can tell you it's a very scary world right now, as we know. It's not just COVID. It's everything that you can think of. Like she said, you're kind of having countries keeping things internal because they're facing the same kind of challenges, which is going to change the whole global situation and economy. Now, what does that mean? I'm getting calls, and this is where the practical thing is. And Trish and I work together all the time on different sides, for different customers. Everything we know and everything we've done, forget. It just isn't working. It isn't the same world. And everything we know in bankruptcy in many respects is going to be a little bit different now. The power change has changed. And so when I'm getting these calls at the beginning of COVID, I got the calls, force majeure, we need to make them produce. And I'm like, you can learn all the force majeure you want in the world. You're not going to be able to fix the pandemic. It's not going to make the companies operate. They've shut down. I'm sorry. What you do need to do is start focusing on allocation, because that's where a lot of the issues are going to rise, and customers are coming up with all sorts of creative ways to start claiming more of the product that's out there. So the big litigation you're going to see later on, I think, or when it gets really intense, is over allocation. Because when force majeure occurs, you're supposed to allocate on a reasonable basis based on the obligations that you had before. And so that's going to get skewed from litigation. But what has really changed now is the supplier and customer relationships. The suppliers have the power at the moment, and it's going to be for a while. The chip shortages, the containers, we've learned now that Walmart, and I think it's Walmart, I know Target's just done it, and what's the other one? Home Depot, they've now basically circuit around everybody else and bought the ships. They actually took the ships out of the whole supply chain, and that's caused another now disruption. There's less ships, but of course, even if you get it into port, there's not labors, there's not things. So what is that happening? You could go into court, and that's where I'm getting these calls and saying, what's the issue? And if they're not shipping, why? Is it financial? Is it that they simply can't get the product? What is it that's causing their prices are quadrupling, even more so? And if they don't have it, you're not going to be able to force them to give it to you. Now, here's the other issue that comes with that on a bankruptcy, and one that I got a supplier call the other day who is a very powerful supplier. They have a product that's very much needed in this country for manufacturing a lot of things. And the bottom line is they were owed a lot of money by a company. And do I have to ship? Well, and what am I going to do? And I'm owed a lot of money. They terminated, in my view, before any court process. Now, what are you going to do as a bank? If you're in restructuring, if you're the lawyer for the debtor, what are you going to do? So I get on the phone and say, how are you going to make me? The bottom line is somebody's going to have to pay for those goods or they're not going to get them. And because there's plenty of other people that want them. And if there's no contract, you can try court orders, but somebody's got to have money to sue the powerhouse who's holding the product. Who's going to fund that litigation? How's this going to work? The bottom line is everything has flipped right now on the power scheme. And so you've got to look at this at a very practical level on what are we going to do about it. Now, at the moment, the customers are looking at the same thing, or wherever you are in the supply chain, we're not getting, I don't think, as many calls as you would think we would get, because we typically deal with troubled suppliers day in, day out. And as Trish stated, especially in the auto industry, what people don't realize is why did we save GM? Why did we save Chrysler? There was a lot of political and other kinds of fallout. But every vehicle has 40,000 little widgets in it, all manufactured by a single source supplier, all of which many have to go through safety. All of them have to go through very, very particular processes in order to approve that little thing that goes in that vehicle. If the vehicle, that means you have 40,000 companies that if one goes down and can't manufacture and that line shuts, all those companies shut. And our job typically often is to make sure those companies operate. So sometimes we have to finance them. If they're in trouble, if they're in financial trouble until we can get them sold or get out. None of that stuff, money isn't necessarily fixing it right now. And so eventually we're going to see the outfall. Everybody's expecting significant. So I'm asking my clients, hey, why haven't you called me? We know this is big. And the bottom line is they're doing what they have to do right now to the extent they can. They're paying the quadruple prices because they have to. How long this power switch goes, we don't know. But I can tell you that the supplier companies are becoming the smaller companies and those with really critical product, and don't overestimate yourself because sometimes there is a way around, and I've seen that happen before. They think they're bigger than they are, but they're getting more and more powerful. So my point is when I'm getting these calls, no matter what side, I want to know practically, how am I going to, is going to court going to help this or not? If it's not, how else can we legally maneuver around this situation to be able to get it? And sometimes we're just not going to be able to fix it. We don't know what's going to come, but I can tell you people, a lot of my clients that are at the top tier that were always the big, gorillas in the room, and they're not so much anymore. And all of a sudden, that's like, their suppliers have the power at the moment. Bankruptcy, same thing. What are you going to do? Critical supplier, they're going to laugh at it. you know? Yeah, that's not going to get them, especially when they're selling on a PO basis. They don't have to sell to you. That's not going to be enough to make it work. So that's sort of the practical of what's going on right now. And so we'd love to hear some of the things that you guys are seeing and what you'd like to know from this panel. I mean, you've got actually these people, and I know it's hard from on screen, but we went back and forth on a lot of these issues. We've seen they've been incredible. And so are we seeing, you know, who's got a bankruptcy right now? Are they seeing the critical vendor issues out here? Has it worked? You know, does anybody have one in the room right now that they're dealing with? No, see, we're kind of slow right now. But the economy, I mean, every single one of them says it cannot sustain itself. And so we're gonna start seeing these companies drop. And the question is, now you're gonna find out how important you are. And if you're gonna keep it going, somebody's gotta pay for it. I can tell you right now, there's one, it could impact government, because nobody knows what to do. You know, not one customer is willing to pick up the slack, but this is a needed supplier. And it provides, you know, all sorts of stuff.
You guys mentioned the labor shortage that we're seeing nationwide,
Incredible.
and that's also playing into supply chain issues. I know when I woke up this morning, the news was covering the fact that Kellogg's, all their workforce went on strike this morning. So I feel like that's a timely example of how all this is going to trickle down. How big of an issue is the labor force?
Huge.
I'm sorry, y'all can't. I was saying that this morning when I woke up, I saw on the news that Kellogg's workforce went on strike this morning, and they're not sure how that's going to affect production or really anything going forward because they don't know if they'll be able to resolve it. Apparently, it's a dispute that's been ongoing for a long time that they haven't been able to resolve. And so I know these ladies talked earlier about the labor shortage in this country, which we're seeing across a lot of different industries. And I wondered how crucial that has been to date in supply chain issues and whether they think that's going to become a bigger issue going
Yeah, I'm
forward.
going to let these guys say, but I can tell you one of the people I spoke to last night, labor absolutely is their largest challenge. They don't need the chips. They don't need those kinds of things, the wires. He said they're importing people left and right. They're throwing them on planes. They're getting them the visas. And these people are reliable because they have to work to maintain their visas. We're actually importing people right now. And they're in Kentucky. And then of course, Ford is planning on building their plant out there. But this is a high paying company that simply has no labor, and they are bringing in plane loads of people on visas to work. And
Yeah,
that's what I heard.
Labor has definitely been a challenge. I was literally just on the phone with a customer the day before yesterday. Supplier is refusing or threatening to stop producing unless we start accommodating financial accommodations to cover overtime and labor, because their costs are going up. And it was one of those really tough conversations you have with your client. Yep, contract says they have to send it to you. Yep, that's the price they have to send it to you for it. But guess what? They're not gonna. And if you want it, then you've got to look at the differential of what is that cost going to be over the course of the balance of your contract versus what it would cost you to move your production somewhere else and potentially face the same issues with labor shortages and raw materials. Because it is not necessarily, a lot of the distress we were seeing was bad management, or I hate to say it, but a lot of private equity investment goes into these suppliers, and they might be stripping the value out very quickly, and you're losing the real incentive to be a strong long-term customer or client, excuse me. And so these issues, as Sheryl points out, are not unique to a particular supplier. Regardless of where you try to buy your product, they're all facing the same issues, whether it's a raw material or a labor shortage. And I think labor is going to be an even bigger, more long-term.
What do they say? Do they?
What do you ladies on the Zoom think?
Yeah, labor is a challenge broadly, and there's a host of reasons behind it. One is pressure on wages, where other prices are going up. As we talked about steel, we talked about transportation, we talked about lumber. There's pressure on wages too. So to the extent that companies aren't or can't respond quickly enough to their labor requirements in that regard, there's unsettled workforces, right? So that's one challenge. The other thing is, I'm sure you've been reading about what's been called now the Great Resignation. There's a large population that one at a time is deciding to change their career, taking this opportunity through the pandemic to shift what they're doing. So where you thought you had a supply of talent, they may now be doing something else. And then there's the continued subsidies from the government in terms of, for some people, it's more beneficial for them just to stay at home and collect unemployment or government subsidies rather than go to work. So all these different pressures are combining to really put a challenge and pressure on the labor situation.
Yeah, and maybe I just like to add one more dimension. I think this whole situation, the whole COVID situation, and the focus on the internal markets, the political situation has so much impact now on the visas that are being extended. So you can see a whole different debate coming into the labor question, because a lot of the Southeast Asian countries are used to migrating workforces, like what I mentioned on the food supply chain, but it also goes to the manufacturing supply chains in the factories. And now you can see that governments are actually having very strict policies, like, how do we make sure that my own population has enough work? So they try to limit the number of visas, or they discriminate on which populations, which groups they actually extend visas to, whether it is labor or whether it's highly skilled, or whether it's even from the country of origin, because they want to balance the cultural diversity or the racial discussions in country. So that all has an impact on the labor force.
Yeah, I've known a lot. The other thing, and this is the problem, you had a perfect storm of a lot of different things, but you had the right sizing in the country. You also had, I think a lot of people know that the older workforce was let go. Older is much younger than we ever thought before. It used to be, our parents told you, you worked until, in 65 and you got your Social Security. And then I think you've seen all the controversy where there's been massive kind of let go, or they gave incentives, as this is before COVID hit, and kind of took everybody out of the workforce 55 and up. And there was a huge downsize along those lines for a lot of companies that kind of internally restructured just before COVID. So you took all of that workforce out, and they have and then you had COVID, and you had the different other things, and women and working home. Nobody wants to go back. They kind of got used to that, and we're not going to be able to change that right away.
The other thing that happened through COVID, particularly in the hospitality industry, was so many of the restaurants that were closed. Those people had to find another way to support themselves. And when they were able to do that, they realized, why am I working for minimum wage or below without any benefits? And so if you haven't already seen increased prices when you go out to a restaurant, you will, because that's the only way they're going to be able to get employees to come back. They are now focusing on their benefits and better pay. I mean, in Little Lebanon, Tennessee, you get a signing bonus and over $14 an hour to work at the local Zaxby's, because the franchise owner cannot get enough people, and he's in there working on the weekends himself just to be able to serve the food and keep the operation going and the lights on.
and nobody wants to work those set hours so it is a crisis that's just increasing prices. The consumers are going to hit it. We're going to be paying more, all of us, for a lot of different things. And so, you know, hitting your day-to-day pocket, even if you're not looking at this from a financial, it's kind of scary, because there's no way to then increase the prices within your own organizations. Right now, you know, law firms generally, M&A and all that, they're doing well. There are different companies being scooped up, but nobody can completely predict this. Something's going to give, and it's going to, you know, really impact us.
And what we see is a lot of companies are starting to talk about what are the issues that they need to figure out and how to overcome them. So we're getting a lot of discussion with them and counseling on how to think through the different things that are happening in the supply chain and with their customers and with their suppliers, and how do they prioritize getting to a resolution.
There's a question out here.
Yeah, I was going to say we have a question here. We'll wrap up with that. Go ahead.
So wait, can you repeat? You're in what? What was it? Sure. Yeah. Yes, so we deal with that day in, day out. We don't like to necessarily advertise it, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
I'm
just to
sorry,
repeat
yeah,
the
repeat.
question so everybody on the Zoom heard it. There was a question from someone who's in Nevada and was saying that they're seeing the casinos, the ultimate users of the gaming machines, covering those price differentials where the suppliers can't supply because the cost has gone up, that they're either bridging that gap with loans or with taking equity in the suppliers, and asking if you all have seen that across other industries and what your experience was.
Yeah, so they're basically adopting some of what the auto industry has adopted a long time ago. And I deal with both, you know, both Trish and I deal with often a lot of on the customer side. We do all sides, but on the customer, on the OE side, which is the GMs, Toyota, and then tier ones are much more difficult because they have to, they're big companies. Like I represent a company that produces 50% of the world's safety product. They have to do that for every single car company. So it's very difficult to maintain. So what has happened historically that we don't necessarily advertise, but it's a well-known thing, is typically we've got to figure out how to finance that company. So we'll finance a supplier that's in trouble, that simply can't operate because it doesn't have the wherewithal to do it. We have to fix the situation, either get them sold or figure out how to keep them operating until we get out. And what we'll do is we'll buy a participation in the secured lenders lien, for example, and finance through that, come in as a second secured. That's one way to do it. Sometimes we have to buy the company. Sometimes we incentivize somebody else. There's all sorts of different ways to put money into a company. And and that's what we're doing on a typical day-to-day basis, and analyzing what we have to do, because if we don't, they go down, our production goes down. So yes, I think you're going to see in other industries more and more of that kind of required. The problem I'm facing now, so that's exactly what I had in this situation, because as a supplier, I said, hey, your customers know how to fix this. But the practical is, they were a customer base that isn't necessarily in the auto industry. They didn't know how to fix it. So as a supplier, I'm telling them, well, they can put money in this way, or this way. The problem is big companies can't move that quickly, or any companies. I mean, to tell a company, you've got to buy a participation in the secured lenders lien and get that done overnight. Their lawyers don't know how to do it. Their finance, it's just not something
They're used to.
done. But the answer is yes, you're going to have to get the money in some way, somehow.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add on that is another common mechanism is through a price increase, and sometimes they do a retro price increase. So it is a way, because some will not loan money into
Right.
companies
Right.
from a policy standpoint, but you have to be very careful. You don't want to throw money into a black hole. If that is a temporary fix because there is a raw material increase that the supplier can't absorb, I always tell my clients, understand the root of the problem and know that what you're going to put in is going to fix it. Let's not put a Band-Aid on a bullet hole. And so you really need to have a very good visual as to what's going on with this
Right.
company. Is it operational? Is it just financial? Is it a supply shortage? Are they mismanaging? They don't have the right labor force. Because if you're going to make that kind of investment, you better figure out it's going to fix the problem, and for how long is it going to fix the problem? And then what is your long-term exit? A sale, a reorg? Is this temporary, or just long enough to get your product from somebody else? And so there are a lot of things that go into that analysis, but that is something, we've been doing that for 20 years in the auto industry, and I do think it's going to ripple into others.
It's going to ripple. But the thing is, and you've got to make sure though, that if you're going to put money in, it doesn't violate your own bank covenants and different things like that. You may have to have somebody else put the money in, and if you do it by, I'm not a fan of price increases, but that's how they're, and I could tell you that's what most of them are dealing with right now.
It almost sounds similar to a dip lending analysis in terms of having to know what you're buying into and whether it's going into the hole. Well, this has been a fantastic presentation. I think, thank you to all of you ladies for doing this and for educating us about this. We've hit the end of the presentation. However, all of these ladies' contact information is in the app. So if you have any follow-up questions, I'm sure they'd be happy to hear from you if you weren't able to ask your question today, or if you're on the Zoom, so you weren't here to be able to raise your hand, definitely feel free to reach out to any of these ladies. Let's give them a round of applause. I think this was fantastic.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take an almost 30-minute break. I think we're a couple of minutes over, and come back at 10:30 to hear about recent issues in commercial real estate cases. That's going to be another